William the Conqueror's son, William II, inherited the throne, but died in a hunting accident and was succeeded by his younger brother Henry. Henry only had one son, named William as well, who tragically died aboard a ship that sunk in the English Channel that was carrying nobles back from Normandy. When Henry died, a succession crisis began between his nephew and his daughter Matilda, who wanted her son Henry II to become king. Matilda had married into the House of Anjou, a kingdom south of Normandy, and thus Henry II, when he succeeded in becoming king, would be the first Angevin king of England, meaning he was the king of Anjou as well. The Angevins had united with the Normans and now controlled large amounts of territory in France and Great Britain until 1199, when their possessions in Normandy and Anjou were lost to the French. The Angevin king John faced civil unrest as his kingdom fell apart. So, to appease the people, he signed the Magna Carta into law and promised certain civil rights to subjects and began the first form of constitutional monarchy in Europe. John subsequently did not follow his own rules in the Magna Carta and was killed by wealthy landowners known as barons, who then installed their chosen king, Henry III. Unfortunately for the barons and the other people of England, Henry III refused to set up a council of barons like he promised, and the barons revolted against him. Although his son Edward defeated the barons and became king in 1272, Edward successfully conquered Wales, but came short when it came to Scotland, which led to an alliance to form between Scotland and France, known as the Auld Alliance. He was succeeded by his son Edward II, conversely flailed in military campaigns on the island, and was overthrown by his French wife Isabella, who appointed Baron Roger Mortimer as new king. Mortimer and Isabella were overthrown in a coup by her own son Edward III, however, in 1330. During the 1340s, England would be ravaged by the Black Plague, and after its end, Edward III needed a way to restore power to the country. He began the Hundred Years' War with France over the English claims to France that through Isabella, in addition to reinvading Scotland in another unsuccessful attempt to conquer them. Edward III outlived his own son, the Black Prince, so he was succeeded by his grandson, Richard II. In 1381, the peasants' revolt broke out in response to high taxes being levied to pay for the Hundred Years' War, and King Richard II crushed the revolt and removed his nephew Henry IV from the royal lineage, who he was suspicious of, who in response invaded the island from France in 1399 and deposed and killed him. The king died in 1413 and was followed by his son Henry V, who was in turn followed by his son Henry VI in 1422. The Hundred Years' War was ultimately unsuccessful, and the English withdrew in 1453. An attempt to salvage the union was made by Henry VI, who married Margaret of Anjou, who was the niece of the French king. This effort failed, and the soldiers returning home, now unemployed, spent their time fighting each other and stealing from civilians. The failure in France caused Henry VI to suffer a mental breakdown, severely damaging his psyche, which allowed his wife Margaret to control the kingdom from behind the scenes. Richard, the popular Duke of York, began to accuse Margaret of using Henry VI's poor mental state to seize power and enrich her inner circle. Richard and Henry VI were in the same united house, known as the Plantagenet, it's probably incorrect, but which was a continuation of the Angevin dynasty and was subsequently made up of the constituent houses of York and Lancaster. At this point, England's economy was destroyed in a civil war known as the War of Roses, which saw Richard in the House of York fight Henry VI in the House of Lancaster for control. Richard captured Henry VI and imprisoned him in the Tower of London. He attempted to then become king, but was killed in battle, and his son Edward IV took his place. Henry VI's only male heir was killed in 1471, and Henry VI shortly after passed away in captivity, marking the end of the House of Lancaster's claim to the throne, with the House of Tudor taking its place. Edward IV passed away in 1483 and was followed by his 12-year-old son Edward V. Edward V was quickly deposed by his uncle Richard III, who locked him and his younger brother in the Tower of London, where they mysteriously disappeared and were never found, presumably have been executed by Richard III to secure his claim. This execution effectively ended York's line of accession to the throne of England. Henry Tudor and his house, who had been allies of Lancaster, raised an army up with support from France, Wales, and Scotland, and challenged Richard III's dubious reign, killing him in battle in 1485. Henry Tudor then became king as Henry VII. The foreign powers worked to help install the Tudor dynasty as an alternative to the houses of York and Lancaster, who Europe saw as overly combative and unstable. Henry VII centralized power and helped establish the English wool industry and created a better functioning system of taxation. He signed the Treaty of Perpetual Peace and married his daughter Margaret off to King James IV of Scotland in an effort to end hostilities, although these largely failed, and he died in 1509 and was followed by his infamous son, Henry VIII. The Auld Alliance pulled Scotland into conflict with England in 1513, with James IV being killed in battle and replaced by his sons James V, who was responsible for bringing Protestantism to Scotland. Henry VIII married his first wife Catherine of Aragon when he ascended to the throne, but was wanting a divorce by 1526 due to the fact that Catherine had not yet produced him a son, with his only child being a daughter named Mary. Anne Boleyn had been serving as Catherine's maid when Henry VIII took notice of her and decided he wanted to marry her instead. He asked for permission from the Catholic Church, but was refused the right to divorce, which was considered a sin in Catholicism. Enraged, Henry VIII instigated the English Reformation, where the Anglican Church became the official Church of England, supplanting Catholicism. He made himself head of the church and established the idea of the divine right of European monarchs to rule their kingdoms from God's will, not from the good graces of the Catholic Church and their papal supremacy. Henry VIII created massive new streams of revenue for the income by redirecting the offering money being paid to Rome to England's coffers, but the kingdom did not see a major increase in wealth since most of this new money was spent on unfruitful wars with Scotland and France. He married Anne in 1533, and they soon had a daughter Elizabeth together. Henry VIII was disappointed that she did not produce a son, and after 3 subsequent miscarriages, he had her imprisoned and beheaded. He then married Jane Seymour in 1536. She produced him a son, Edward VI, but she died shortly after from pregnancy complications. During this time, Henry VIII ordered the beginning of a gradual conquest and settlement of Ireland, bringing them into the English fold. The Irish Gaels had long been under the influence of the Pope rather than England due to their strong following of Catholicism ever since St. Patrick had brought the faith to the island back in the 400s. But the power of the English regardless forced them to sign the Crown of Ireland Act, naming Henry VIII as King of the Island. In 1540, Henry VIII looked to marry Anne Cleves of the Holy Roman Empire to forge a Protestant alliance against the power of France and the papacy. Going off a painted portrait of Anne, Henry VIII was incredibly disappointed with her physical attractiveness when he met her and was wanting to call off the wedding, but decided to go through with it anyway for political reasons. On their wedding night, the king and queen were unable to successfully have intercourse, which led to Henry calling for the marriage to be annulled. As part of the divorce proceedings, Henry specified that the consummation did not occur, but it was not due to his impotence, using the fact that he had recently experienced nocturnal emissions. Shortly after the wedding was called off, Henry VIII married 17-year-old Catherine Howard while he was 49. By this time, Henry was obese due to immobility because of a jousting injury and suffered from ulcers on his legs. The pain from the ulcers caused him to alternate between feelings of depression and rage. Catherine was unattracted to the old king and began an affair with her previous lover, Thomas Culpeper. When the king found out about the affair, he had young Catherine and Thomas both beheaded. James V of Scotland died in 1542 and was followed by his daughter Mary, the Queen of Scots. That following year, Henry VIII married his 6th and final wife, Catherine Parr, who was able to convince the king to include his daughters in the line of succession. Henry VIII died in 1547 from scurvy and general poor health and was followed by his son Edward VI. Catherine later married the Baron Thomas Seymour, and they adopted the younger Elizabeth as their own. It was during this time that Thomas would molest Elizabeth, mentally scarring her an event that would most likely leading to her life of celibacy. The Anglican Church up to this point had essentially been an offshoot of Catholicism, which changed under Edward VI, who made the official change to Protestant. Before his death, Henry VIII had ordered the invasion of Scotland to end the Auld Alliance and force the Scots to allow Queen Mary to marry Edward VI, which would unite the kingdoms. Unfortunately for King Edward VI, he became terminally ill at age 15 and would never marry. He and his advisors decided to pass the throne on to his Protestant cousin, Lady Jane, passing over his Catholic sisters in 1553. She ruled for just 9 days until supporters of Edward VI's sister Mary deposed her and locked her in the Tower of London, executing her the following year. Mary spent the reign attempting to roll back the Protestant reforms of her brother's previous administration. Mary married King Philip II of Spain, which also brought Catholic Spain into England's fold. Mary was ruthless in her efforts to expel Protestants from England, earning her the nickname Bloody Mary. More than anything, Mary wanted a child, but was unable to become pregnant due to her having ovarian cysts. She interpreted this as God punishing her for not doing more to expel the Protestant heretics, so she stepped up her actions and ultimately executed 280 Protestants by burning them at the stake. Her efforts to permanently shift England back to Catholicism failed, however, and she died in 1558 and was replaced by her sister Elizabeth. In 1565, Mary, Queen of the Scots, married Lord Darnley, and they had a son together named James. Mary appointed her friend and Italian nobleman David Rizzio as Scotland's secretary to Italy. Lord Darnley became jealous after he heard a rumor Mary was having an affair with David, and he had him ambushed and stabbed to death while out at a dinner with the Queen. The following year, Lord Darnley was found strangled to death in a stable on his property after a massive explosion was reported at his house. Witnesses reported seeing a group of men led by Earl James Hepburn. A conspiracy emerged that Mary had Lord Hepburn assassinate Lord Darnley as revenge for killing her friend David, which came about after a servant reported seeing Mary and Lord Hepburn speaking in secret following the murder. Public outrage began once it became known that Mary was to marry Lord Hepburn, and she was forced to abdicate and flee to England. Because Mary was Catholic and had a claim to the throne, many Catholic English viewed her as the rightful queen, which went against Elizabeth's plan on solidifying the power of the new Church of England. After years of holding her in house arrest, Mary was beheaded in 1586 after it was discovered she had written letters discussing the assassination of Queen Elizabeth. The time of Elizabeth's reign became known as the Elizabethan era due to the distinct prosperity that England experienced while the rest of Europe was stagnating following the Counter-Reformation. The arts flourished, with the most prominent figurehead being William Shakespeare, who wrote famous plays such as Romeo and Juliet to be performed in the prominent Globe Theatre. The budget for the Royal Navy was greatly increased, and a new focus on naval exploration was made and produced famous explorers such as Francis Drake, who circumnavigated the globe and began the English practice of privacy by raiding the Spanish and Portuguese ships carrying high-value commodities such as gold. At this time, France was weak from their own internal divisions between Catholics and Protestants, and it was the Austrian House of Habsburg that was the preeminent power on the European continent. Through strategic marriages, the Habsburgs came to control vast amounts of territory outside of Austria, both directly and indirectly, including the valuable possessions of Spain and the Netherlands, which were known as the Spanish Netherlands due to the Habsburgs running their territory through Spanish administration. In 1585, an uprising occurred in Spanish Netherlands against Spanish rule, which caused King Philip II to invade the Netherlands. The English entered the fighting by supporting the Protestant Dutch rebels who were fighting for the free practice of their religion. In 1588, the Spanish sent a large naval fleet to England known as the Spanish Armada with the goal of ousting Elizabeth and restoring Catholicism. The invasion failed, and much of the Armada was destroyed by English fireboats in the English Channel. The following year, the English sent their own armada, led by Francis Drake, down to the Spanish coast with the goal of destroying the remainder of the Spanish fleet while it was being repaired. The English armada was ill-planned, and the attack was a disaster, and the war came to a standstill, both in the Netherlands and at sea. Philip II died in 1598 from cancer and was followed by his son Philip III, who was much more open to peace with England. The costs of the war were beginning to hurt England's finances, and once Queen Elizabeth died in 1603, a peace treaty was signed that promised to return to the status quo before the conflict, wherein both sides would stop military activities in Netherlands, and England would cease piracy activities targeting Spanish boats. Elizabeth was followed up by James of Scotland, who upon accession proclaimed a union of the crowns between Scotland and England. Both would remain independent kingdoms, but would work in concert when handling foreign affairs for Great Britain. With the death of Elizabeth, the Tudor dynasty finally came to an end after a 118-year reign. Today, the impacts of the Tudor era live on in the form of the distinct Tudor style of architecture.